When 6-year-old Tiana Johnson showed up to school dressed as her hero, her dad, WWE legend Dwayne The Rock Johnson, she expected cheers. Instead, she became the target of relentless bullying. But what her bullies didn't expect was what came next. It started with a paper crown. Tiana Johnson had spent the night before Famous People Day humming to herself, snipping, gluing, and coloring in thick black Sharpie lines onto cardboard. The crown was part of her costume, a nod to one of her favorite moments from her dad's WWE matches when he strutted into the ring calling himself the People's Champion, like royalty. Her little hands were clumsy with the tape, but her determination was fierce. She even practiced his eyebrow in the mirror, giggling when her reflection looked more like a confused puppy than a wrestling legend. Still, she was proud. Her dad, Dwayne, stood quietly in the doorway of her room that night, arms folded, smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's a pretty serious look, Tiny," he'd said. She beamed. "I'm going to own that classroom." "Daddy," he crouched down beside her. "Say it again." "I'm going to own that classroom." He leaned in close, the way he did before a match, voice dropping low. "Then you walk in there like the champ you are. You don't ask for space. Tiana, you take it." Tiana nodded with the gravity of someone who believed down to her pink socks that her dad's words were magic. The next morning, she walked into Ms. Henderson's first-grade class wearing a faux leather vest, tiny sunglasses, a drawn-on goatee, and a belt made from tinfoil and cardboard. She was The Rock, the real one, and she wasn't just playing dress-up. She was proud of her dad, of herself. That pride lasted about 9 minutes. It started with a whisper, a giggle. Then came the voices, loud enough to sting. "Why is she dressed like a boy? Hugh, is that a beard? She looks ridiculous." If the ringleader, a girl named Stacy with perfectly braided pigtails and a unicorn sweater, strutted up with her group in tow. She looked Tiana up and down, nose wrinkled. "You're supposed to dress as someone cool, not some man who grunts and throws people." Tiana blinked. "He's my dad." "That's even weirder," Stacy scoffed. "Your dad wears underwear." On TV, the girls exploded into laughter. Tiana just stood there, holding her belt, the crown slipping from her head. The rest of the day blurred in flashes, laughter behind cupped hands, sticky notes that read, "Mr. Tiana," a boy mimicking wrestling, moves and pretending to body slam her backpack. Tiana didn't cry, not once, not until she got home. She sat at the edge of her bed, costume still on, cardboard belt askew. Her fingers clenched and unclenched the crown in her lap. Dwayne had just come back from a shoot, his usual boulder-sized presence reduced to worried silence when he saw her. "Hey, champ," he said gently. Tiana didn't answer. He crouched beside her, his massive hand resting on her back. "Want to tell me what happened?" She stared at her crown, voice small. "They laughed at me." "Who did?" "The girls, Stacy. They said it was dumb to dress like you." "Said it's weird to want to be like my dad." Dwayne's jaw tightened. "That's not weird, that's awesome." "They said you wear underwear on TV." He blinked, then tried to suppress a chuckle, but when he saw the pain in her eyes, the smile vanished. "Did they hurt you?" Tiana hesitated. "Not with their hands." There was a long silence. Then Dwayne stood, not angry, not loud, but something shifted in his eyes, like a storm cloud rolling in with purpose. "Okay, we're going to fix this." She looked up, blinking through tears. "How?" "Not with fists, not with shouting. We're going to show them who we are." And that's when the idea took hold. That night, while Tiana slept curled up beside her battered costume, Dwayne paced the living room floor, phone in hand, firing off texts and calls to trainers, school, board members, a few friends from WWE. The vision was hazy, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about one costume or one day. This was about a culture. He wanted to start a youth wrestling program at Tiana's school, not to teach kids how to fight, but to teach them how to respect each other. Respect the ring, he called it in his notes. A space where physical strength met emotional strength, where kids like Tiana could find confidence, and bullies like Stacy could learn empathy, or face the consequences of their actions in a controlled, constructive way. The first step? A meeting with the school principal. But what Dwayne didn't know yet was that Stacy's mother was on the school board, and she had a very different idea of what was appropriate for children. Dwayne stepped into the school gym the next morning, where the principal was already waiting. But he wasn't alone. Seated beside him, arms folded, a forced smile on her face, was Stacy's mom, and she wasn't interested in anything that involved rings, wrestling, or Dwayne Johnson. The tension in the gym was immediate, palpable, like the static before a thunderstorm. Dwayne stepped through the double doors, wearing a fitted black button-up and dark jeans, towering and composed, his presence commanding without saying a word. His boots echoed across the polished wood floor with each deliberate step. He'd faced roaring crowds, steel chairs, and sold-out arenas. But this room, this meeting, this was personal. Principal Harmon rose from his chair near the folded bleachers, his smile strained. "Mr. Johnson, thanks for coming in." Dwayne extended a hand, firm but respectful. "Thanks for making the time." Beside Harmon sat a woman in a stiff mauve blazer, hair pulled into a severe bun so tight it looked painful. Her expression didn't shift when Dwayne entered, but her crossed legs and the subtle tightening of her jaw said everything. She offered her hand like it was a business transaction she resented having to close. "Elaine Mercer," she said coolly, "chairwoman of the school board." Then, as though to twist the knife just a little deeper, "and Stacy's mother." Dwayne sat, suppressing the flicker of heat in his chest. He gave her a cordial nod. "Appreciate you being here, Elaine." Leaned forward, perfectly poised, her voice polite but sharp. "Let me be candid, Mr. Johnson. While we all sympathize with Tiana's difficulties, we have to consider what's in the best interest of all students. Turning this school into some kind of wrestling dojo is not the answer." Dwayne folded his hands in front of him, slow and measured. "It's not about wrestling for the sake of wrestling. It's about discipline, confidence, a structured program that teaches respect, accountability, values that last a lifetime. Kids listen when they're engaged, and right now, a lot of them aren't." Elaine's laugh was quiet, mirthless. "And you think body slams and ropes are going to solve bullying?" Principal Harmon cleared his throat awkwardly, sensing the electricity building. "Well, I do think the idea has some merit. We've discussed the importance of anti-bullying initiatives." "I'm not here for a PR stunt," Elaine cut in, sharply. "And frankly, I'm not sure Tiana's experience justifies a complete overhaul of our extracurricular activities." Dwayne's hands tightened, just a little. He looked her squarely in the eyes. "You think this is about a dress-up day?" Elaine blinked. "Isn't it?" She came home in tears, not once, every day since. She's 6 years old and already questioning whether being proud of her family makes her less than. "She's not the only student," Elaine replied smoothly. "There are dozens of children in this school, and quite frankly, some parents are concerned about your influence." Dwayne narrowed his eyes. "Concerned how?" She hesitated just long enough to choose her next words like daggers. "About the glorification of violence. Your brand, Mr. Johnson. It might be fine for TV, but it's not exactly what we want in a school gym." The room hung silent for a beat. Then Dwayne stood, slowly, powerfully, not in threat but in declaration. When he spoke, his voice was low but filled with unmistakable gravity. "My brand isn't violence, it's perseverance. It's rising every time you're knocked down. It's looking a kid in the eye who's been made to feel small and showing them they're not." Elaine opened her mouth to respond, but Harmon raised a hand, sensing something shifting. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," he said quickly. "What if we started small, a trial program, after school, optional? We keep it off the regular curriculum for now, and—" "I'll fund it," Dwayne interrupted. Elaine blinked. "Excuse me? I'll cover equipment, instructors, insurance, everything. The school won't pay a cent. I don't want special treatment. Just a chance to show you what this could be." Elaine's silence was calculating. She couldn't refuse outright, not without looking like she was stonewalling something built on positive values, not with Dwayne Johnson offering to bankroll the entire thing. But the look in her eyes said one thing clearly: she would find a way to make this fail. Later that afternoon, Tiana sat cross-legged in the living room, her sketchbook open across her lap. She'd drawn a tiny ring, ropes colored in with red, and gold markers. Inside it were little cartoon kids smiling, hands clasped. She titled the page, "Respect the Ring," just like Daddy said. Dwayne knelt down beside her. "You drew this?" She nodded, chewing on her pencil. "Can it be real?" He placed a hand on her back. "It's gonna be." Her eyes lit up. "For real, real," he nodded. "First trials next week. After school, you'll be the first one in the ring." A flicker of doubt passed over her face. "But what if the other kids don't come? What if they just laugh again?" Dwayne was quiet a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. From it, he slid a silver pendant on a thin chain, a tiny replica of the championship belt. He clasped it around her neck. "Let them laugh, baby girl, and then show them why you wore it." The following week, the gym smelled like rubber mats and fresh paint. Banners with the words "Respect the Ring" were tacked along the walls. A small portable ring had been installed in the center, safe, padded, non-regulation-sized but powerful in its presence. Dwayne stood beside it, clipboard in hand, waiting. The clock ticked past 3, then past 3:10. He looked toward the doors. Nothing. He didn't say it out loud, but disappointment tugged at the back of his throat, until a creak. The gym doors cracked. "Open." Tiana stepped in slowly, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes wide with awe. Behind her, 2 kids followed, then 3 more, then a dozen. Some came out of curiosity, others out of boredom. A few had clearly been dragged by parents, but they came. Dwayne gave Tiana a little nod. Her shoulders squared, but then, just as the warm-up was about to begin, another group entered. Stacy, flanked by her usual trio. She wasn't wearing her unicorn sweaters today. She wore athletic tights and a smirk. "What's this supposed to be?" she sneered loudly. Tiana stiffened, the color draining from her face. Stacy walked up to the mat, looking at the ring like it was a joke. "Oh, I get it," she said with a grin. "You think if you learn to wrestle, we'll all just bow down?" Dwayne stepped forward, voice even. "You're welcome to participate, but in here, there are rules." Stacy crossed her arms. "Like what?" "No teasing, no mocking. And everyone gets respect, until they prove they don't deserve it." Stacy's eyes glittered. "Oh, I can earn that." She turned to her friends. "I want to wrestle her," she said, pointing straight at Tiana. And in that moment, every eye in the gym turned to the smallest girl in the room. As she took one step forward, not away, toward the ring, toward her bully, toward something that was no longer fear, but fire, Tiana's foot landed softly on the mat. It gave slightly under her weight, springy and unfamiliar. But she didn't flinch. Her heart was slamming against her chest like fists on a locked door, yet she didn't hesitate. She looked up at her father. Dwayne gave her a nod, not the kind of nod that said, "You can do this," but one that meant, "I know you already are." That quiet, unshakable confidence in her made something click deep in Tiana's chest, like a gear shifting into place. Across from her, Stacy grinned like she'd already won. She kicked off her sneakers and climbed onto the mat with exaggerated flair, stretching her arms over her head. Her ponytail bounced like it was in on the joke. The other kids gathered along the edge of the mat, unsure whether this was some kind of show or if they were about to witness an actual confrontation. Dwayne raised his hand gently to calm the crowd. All right, this isn't WWE Raw, okay?" he said, voice steady but firm. "This ring is for respect. That means we don't wrestle to beat each other. We wrestle to learn. If you're here to hurt someone, you're in the wrong place." Stacy gave him a wide-eyed look of innocence, the kind only a truly practiced mean girl could pull off. "Oh, I'm here to learn, Mr. Johnson. Promise." Tiana swallowed hard. Her legs felt like they were made of hollow wood, her arms too stiff, her breathing shallow. Then her dad's voice cut through the haze. Low, grounding. "What's the first rule of the ring, T?" She blinked. "Control." "And the second?" "Respect." Dwayne crouched at the edge of the mat. "And the third?" Tiana hesitated, then smiled slightly, never backed down. "Oh, that's my girl," he murmured. The two girls stood at the center of the mat. Tiana's palms were sweaty, her fingers trembling. Stacy, meanwhile, looked like she was posing for an Instagram photo. She smirked, one hand on her hip, the other flexing like she was about to drop-kick a stuffed animal. "Ready?" Dwayne called out. The room went quiet. "Go." Stacy lunged first, not with technique or control, just with raw, bratty confidence. She charged with arms flailing, trying to wrap around Tiana like a tornado of limbs. But Dwayne had taught Tiana one thing above all: stay grounded. Tiana pivoted, dropping her weight and twisting her body just enough to let Stacy's momentum carry her forward too far. Stacy stumbled, caught herself, and turned back, annoyed. "Oh, that's how it's gonna be," she sneered. Tiana didn't respond. Her breath steadied, her knees bent slightly. She was present now, more than she had ever been. Stacy came at her again, but this time Tiana met her mid-step. She placed her hands on Stacy's shoulders, not shoving, not striking, but redirecting her with a soft precision. The crowd started to murmur. Stacy tripped and hit the mat with a dull thud. A few kids gasped. Tiana froze. Stacy stared up at her. From the floor, cheeks flushed red, not from pain, but from something worse. Embarrassment. Her face twisted. "You pushed me," she barked. "No," Tiana said quietly. "I didn't." "She didn't," someone else said from the crowd, a boy near the front. Then another voice chimed in. "It looked like she used that move he showed us." Stacy stood, fists clenched. "This is stupid," she muttered, brushing herself off. Her cool was unraveling. Dwayne approached the ring slowly, the tone of his voice dipping into something firmer. "Stacy," he said evenly, "you've got two choices. You can stay, learn something, and be part of this. Or you can leave. But what you can't do is tear someone down because they're braver than you expected." The words landed heavy. Stacy glanced around. The faces staring at her weren't laughing. They weren't cheering her on. For the first time in a long time, they weren't on her side, and that terrified her. Without a word, she stepped off the mat, snatched up her shoes, and marched out of the gym, her posse trailing after her like confused ducklings. The door banged. Shut behind them. Silence lingered. Then Dwayne clapped his hands. "All right, let's get to work." After that day, Respect the Ring grew fast, faster than anyone expected. Word spread. The after-school program turned into a waiting list. What started as a dozen curious kids became nearly 50 in 2 weeks. Parents showed up to watch. Teachers stayed late to help supervise. Even Principal Harmon started coming around more often, quietly impressed by the transformation happening in the very gym he once considered underutilized. But nothing changed more than Tiana. She didn't just grow braver. She grew louder, stronger, more sure of herself. She started helping younger kids in the program, showing them how to shift their weight, how to fall without fear. They listened to her, looked up to her. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, Dwayne handed Tiana a bottle of water and sat beside her on the bleachers. "You know," he said, "you've got a real presence." Tiana wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Like yours," he smiled. "Not like mine. Better." She giggled, a little shy still, but proud. He tilted his head. "How would you feel about helping me train the new kids next week?" Her eyes lit up. "Really? Really? You've earned it." But while the gym thrived, not everyone was happy. Elaine Mercer watched from a distance, her face unreadable during every school board meeting where the program was praised. She nodded politely when other parents spoke in support of it. She even clapped during a short student demonstration held during an assembly. But behind the scenes, she was planning. She wasn't going to let Dwayne Johnson build an empire in her school, and she certainly wasn't going to let her daughter become the villain in some feel-good redemption arc. So, she made a phone call, not to the school board, not to the principal. To a parent with an old grudge and just enough motivation to stir the pot. The next Monday, Dwayne arrived at the gym to find a folded note taped to the doors. Bold, typed letters. Respect the ring is under review. Program suspended. Until further notice, Tiana stood behind him, clutching her backpack, eyes wide. "What does that mean?" she asked. He stared at the sign, jaw clenched, heart heavy. "It means someone's trying to shut us down." Tiana stared at the sign as if it might change under her gaze. Her small fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. Behind her, a few kids trickled in, parents in tow, chatting casually, until they too noticed the notice. The air shifted, excitement dulled into confusion, whispers spread. Dwayne stood motionless for a moment, his eyes locked on the words like they were a threat he couldn't punch. His chest rose slowly, then sank. Not from defeat, never that, but calculation. He'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the biggest fights didn't happen in the ring. They happened in boardrooms, in silence. Behind closed doors where the rules were rigged, he turned to Tiana and dropped to a knee. "Hey," he said, quietly, his voice warm but measured. "This doesn't mean it's over." Her lower lip trembled, but she didn't cry. Not this time. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, eyes glistening. "No," he said firmly. "You did everything, right? That's why they're scared." "Scared of what?" Dwayne looked past her, to the gathering crowd. Parents looking for answers. Kids holding their gym bags, unsure what to do. He met her eyes again. Scared of change, Tiana didn't speak, but the set of her jaw said she understood more than a 6-year-old should have to. Just then Principal Harmon came hurrying down the hall toward the gym, his tie askew, his brow shiny with sweat. "Mr. Johnson," he said, out of breath, "I just saw the notice. This didn't come from me, I swear." "Then who?" Dwayne asked. Harmon rubbed the back of his neck. "It came from the district. Official complaint was filed over the weekend. Claims the program's promoting aggression, that it's not aligned with district values." Dwayne narrowed his eyes. "Let me guess, Elaine Mercer?" Harmon hesitated, then gave the smallest of nods. Dwayne exhaled through his nose. "Of course. She's pulled in some leverage," Harmon added, voice low. "A few other board members are backing her. They're saying it's too early to judge the program's success. That it's gotten too much attention too fast. It's ruffling feathers." "It's helping kids," Dwayne said. "That should ruffle feathers." "I agree," Harmon said, hands raised. "I'm on your side, but my hands are tied right. Now." "Then untie them." The principal blinked. Dwayne rose to full height, his voice no louder, but now carrying that unshakable tone that once silenced entire stadiums. "If this program goes dark, even temporarily, we're telling every bullied kid in this school that when they finally find something that lifts them up, somebody in charge will still find a way to take it." Harmon looked away, uncomfortable, but not unaffected. Tiana slipped her hand into her dad's. She wasn't hiding behind him, she was standing beside him. Then, something unexpected. A parent, Mrs. Delgado, whose son Mateo was shy and withdrawn before joining the program, stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "can we help?" Dwayne turned. "I mean, what can we do?" she continued. "This isn't just about you and Tiana. This program's changed my boy. I've seen it. He stands taller now. He talks more. You're not the only one who believes in this." Others began nodding. A chorus of soft affirmations followed. "My daughter actually likes gym class now. My kid hasn't had an anxiety attack in a week. He teaches his little sister the warm-up." Stretches. Dwayne's jaw flexed. He hadn't expected this. Support, sure, but not this groundswelling. This was more than defense. It was community. It was a movement. "All right," he said slowly, scanning the faces. "If they want to pause us, fine. We don't stop. We shift." He looked at Harmon. You said the gym's off limits now? Temporarily. Then we take it outside, the lot behind the cafeteria. There's space. I'll bring mats. You tell me there's no rule against gathering kids for a private session on public grounds, right? Harmon gave him a wary look. Technically, no. But the board won't like it. Dwayne grinned. They don't have to. We're not breaking rules. We're bending them into better shapes. By the end of the day, the backlot was alive with energy. Folding mats lined the concrete. A boombox blasted warm-up music. Parents brought snacks. Someone even donated cones to mark out the bohem space. It wasn't fancy, but it had heart, real heart. Tiana helped tape signs to the fence. Respect the ring, unofficial, unstoppable. She turned just as Mateo approached with a water bottle in hand. Thanks, he mumbled, handing it to her. For, standing up. Tiana blinked. I didn't really do anything. You kinda did, he said. Stacy used to mess with me too. She doesn't anymore. Tiana didn't know what to say, so she just smiled. A small, real one. And suddenly, the fight felt worth it. But while the makeshift session buzzed with joy, across town, Elaine Mercer sat at a long oak table, surrounded by school board members, city officials, and a single journalist from the local paper. She tapped her manicured nails on a folder marked Incident Reports. Mr. Johnson's intentions may be noble, she said, voice calm and cool as winter steel, but this isn't the Wild West. We have protocols for a reason. We cannot allow a celebrity, no matter how beloved, to operate rogue educational programs with zero oversight. The journalist raised a brow. Have there been any actual complaints from parents? Elaine slid a sheet across the table. One, from a father whose son came home with bruises. No supervision, no medical support. Imagine the liability. Which student? The journalist asked. Elaine smiled thinly. She didn't answer. Because she didn't need to. The point wasn't the truth, it was the perception. That night, Dwayne sat on the back porch of their house, elbows resting on his knees, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The house was quiet. Tiana was inside, drawing again. He could hear the soft scratch of crayons on paper through the window. He didn't hear her step outside until she was beside him, holding a fresh drawing. It showed a massive ring in the middle of a giant arena, crowds around it, banners waving, and in the center, a girl, small but fierce, raising her arms in victory. He looked down at it, then up at her. You think we'll get to build it that big someday? He asked softly. Tiana shrugged. I already did. He smiled, throat tight. But before the moment could settle, his phone buzzed on the table beside them, a text from Harmon, urgent. Elaine called an emergency board vote for Friday. They want to shut it all down, permanently. Dwayne stared at the screen, then at the stars above, then at his daughter. Because if the board wanted a fight, they were about to get one. Rain fell in sheets on the morning of the board vote, the kind of cold, steady downpour that seemed to soak through more than just clothes. It slipped into bones, into thoughts, into resolve. The sky was the color of wet ash. A Monday that felt like a Monday. Dwayne Johnson stood in front of the bathroom mirror, tying a deep navy blue tie with slow precision. His expression was unreadable, calm on the surface, but his eyes betrayed the current under it. Focus, wait, fire, banked and waiting. Behind him, in the doorway, Tiana leaned against the frame, dressed in a tiny black blazer, jeans, and the silver pendant he'd given her. She didn't say anything at first, just watched her father in the mirror. You look like you're going to WrestleMania, she finally said. Dwayne smiled at her reflection. Feels like it. Are they really going to shut it down? He turned to face her, kneeling to her level. I don't know, baby. But I know one thing. What? We don't go in there scared. Tiana nodded, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a stack of folded papers. Crayon drawings, smudged from handling. Each one showed a different kid standing proud in the ring. One had Stacy in it too, on the ropes, grinning, hands outstretched to tag Tiana. She gave me this last week, Tiana said, pointing to that one. She's not mean anymore. Dwayne took a slow breath. That matters. He tucked the drawings into a folder alongside his prepared notes. Then he stood, offered her his hand, and she took it without hesitation. The school board meeting had been moved to the town hall auditorium to accommodate the crowd. The place was packed. Parents, students, teachers, curious onlookers, reporters from the local news station. The air buzzed with conversation and expectation. People turned as Dwayne and Tiana entered, some standing instinctively, like a ripple of respect followed them down the aisle. Elaine Mercer sat at the center of the board's table, flanked by her usual allies. She was dressed sharply, every line of her posture rigid. Her expression didn't change when she saw them arrive, but her knuckles tensed slightly round her. Principal Harmon gave Dwayne a small nod from his seat beside the board members, tension carved deep into his shoulders. The gavel struck once, crisp and sharp. This session of the East Hill School District Board is now in order. Item 1 on the agenda: review and vote on the continuation of the Respect the Ring Youth program following submitted complaints and concerns. Elaine adjusted her microphone. Before we open the floor, she said, voice poised, I would like to acknowledge that this discussion is not about personal vendettas or fame. It's about policy, what we allow in our schools, and what we deem appropriate for child development. The Respect the Ring initiative, while inspiring to some, has raised substantial concerns about physical safety, liability, and the long-term message we're sending. Murmurs rippled through the audience. A woman in the back whispered too loudly. She's scared of kids learning confidence, Elaine continued, ignoring the room. Therefore, I propose a vote to permanently suspend the program and any affiliated activities until a complete review is conducted by an external educational standards consultant. Point of order, Dwayne said, his voice cutting clean. Through the static, the room stilled. Elaine blinked, then gestured stiffly. Mr. Johnson, you'll have your time. He nodded. And I'll use it now. He stepped forward, Tiana watching him from the second row, legs swinging nervously under. The chair, Dwayne placed the folder on the podium and opened it, withdrawing the drawings one by one. He held up the first. This is Tiana's, he said. She drew it the night after Stacy called her a freak in front of half her class. There was a hush. Even Elaine looked unsettled for a moment. She didn't draw herself fighting back. She drew herself standing tall with her classmates behind her. She wasn't imagining payback. She was imagining belonging. He held up another. This one's Mateo's. He used to eat lunch alone. Now he's got 3 friends and a new nickname, the Anchor. He gave himself that name because he learned how to plant his feet and say no without fear. Dwayne let the silence hang, his voice growing quieter, deeper. This program isn't about wrestling. That's just the tool. It's about kids learning their own strength, emotional, mental, physical. It's about giving them a space where they don't have to be anyone but themselves, and that self is enough. He took a step closer to the board. If there's concern about safety, let's address it. I'll bring in certified youth trainers, medics, waivers. We'll make it airtight. But if the issue is that it's me behind it, say that out loud. Elaine's face hardened. This isn't personal, Mr. Johnson. He looked at her. Not with anger, but with piercing clarity. Yes, it is. He turned back to the room. If you shut this down, you're not stopping me. You're telling these kids that the moment they find something real, something powerful, you'll strip it from them because it makes you uncomfortable. A slow murmur of agreement moved through the audience. Someone clapped once, then a few more joined, then more. Dwayne held up his hand, gently settling them. Let's be better than that. He stepped back. Elaine cleared her throat. Thank you for your remarks. We will now proceed with comments from board members only before voting. But before she could move on, a voice rang out. I want to speak. It was Tiana. She had stood up on the chair, face flushed, but eyes bright. Elaine tried to wave her down, but the room wasn't with. Her anymore? Principal Harmon leaned forward. She's a student, chairwoman. I think we should hear her. Elaine sat back, jaw clenched. Tiana walked to the microphone. The stand was too high. Dwayne stepped forward, adjusted it. She gave him a tiny nod. My name is Tiana Johnson. I'm 6. And I got made fun of for, dressing like my dad. It made me feel small, but when I got to go to the ring, I didn't feel small anymore. I felt big. Not because I was wrestling, because nobody laughed. They cheered. Her voice wavered, but didn't break. And I think if you take it away, you're telling all the other kids who feel small that they have to stay that way. The silence that followed was deafening. Tiana stepped down and returned to her seat. Dwayne reached over, placed his hand on hers, and she gripped his pinky with a smile. Elaine cleared her throat again. Very well. We'll now vote. A board member to her left raised his hand. Before we vote, I'd like to propose an amendment. Elaine's eyes flicked to him, confused. What sort of amendment? He adjusted his glasses. That instead of suspending the program, we vote to expand it under official district oversight and support. Gasps. A few cheers. Elaine paled. You can't just... We can, another member interrupted. It's within procedural bounds. A pause. Let's vote, someone said. Elaine opened her mouth, but the tide had turned. The board voted. 6 in favor of expansion. 1, Elaine against. The crowd erupted. Kids leapt to their feet. Tiana hugged her dad, squealing. Dwayne's eyes shone as he kissed the top of her head. But as Elaine left the table, eyes cold, lips pursed, she leaned into her phone and made a call. This isn't over, she whispered. If they want the spotlight, let's see how they handle it on the national stage. The spotlight came faster than anyone expected. 3 days after the school board vote, a sleek black SUV rolled into the East Hill Elementary parking lot, followed by a satellite news van. Then 2 more. Then a cluster of reporters with oversized cameras and clipped voices, herding toward the front office like sharks drawn to blood. Dwayne had just pulled up to drop Tiana off. He clocked the vans immediately. Branding he recognized. From morning cable networks, the kind that framed every story like a showdown. The SUV's door opened, and a woman in heels stepped out, flanked by a cameraman and a young producer with a clipboard. Mr. Johnson, she called, sunglasses sliding. Down the bridge of her nose, Dana Corwin, Good Morning America. Can we get a comment about your program? Is it true the school board's decision is causing internal conflict? Tiana squeezed his hand, shrinking behind him as the cameras angled down toward her. He stepped in front of her, his voice firm, but calm. No comment right now. Are you planning to bring Respect the Ring to other schools? Are there talks with the WWE? Dwayne turned his body slightly, shielding Tiana from the lens. Today's not about any of that. It's just a school day. Dana smiled professionally. It's not just a school anymore, Mr. Johnson. This is national now. And she wasn't wrong. By lunch, the school's phone lines were jammed. Shothabio principal's inbox exploded. Dozens of articles began circulating online, some celebrating the program as revolutionary, others accusing it of glamorizing violence and circumventing traditional education models. Conservative pundits called it a celebrity power grab. Advocates praised it as a turning point in how we teach emotional strength. But perhaps the most unexpected voice to chime in came from the very organization Dwayne had once built. His name upon the WWE. Their press release was brief but powerful. We support any initiative that uses the spirit of the ring to empower the next generation. Respect the Ring is officially recognized as an affiliate youth mentorship model. Our doors are open. Tiana saw the headline on her dad's phone over dinner that night. Her eyes went wide. So, it's real now? Like, really real? Dwayne chuckled, running a hand over his shaved head. It was always real, baby. Now it's just louder. She looked thoughtful for a moment. Does that mean it's going to be everywhere? Maybe, he said, but only if we do it right. If we keep the heart in it. She nodded solemnly, chewing her mac and cheese like a general planning a campaign. But even as the national attention grew, so did the resistance. Elaine Mercer wasn't done. She'd gone silent after the vote, but her silence was tactical, strategic. She began making calls to parent organizations outside East Hill. Talking points were prepared and distributed. Concerned mothers in nearby districts began echoing her language. Risk of injury, celebrity worship, inappropriate for school settings. She used a carefully curated story. A father claiming his son was pressured into sparring, claims of cliques forming around the program, that it was creating a divide, not healing one. She never needed these claims to be fully true, just true enough to seed doubt. And when she landed a spot on a national panel discussion show, a live debate segment opposite Dwayne himself, she saw it as her moment to reclaim the narrative. Dwayne didn't want to do it. He hated the theater of televised arguments, hated the rehearsed outrage, and the way no one truly listened. But the program was spreading. 3 schools in neighboring districts had already requested guidance. 2 had been put on hold because of parent protests. He knew if he didn't show up, the space would be filled by fearmongers and opportunists. So he agreed. The studio was a sterile box of lights and tension. Cameras poised, producers whispering into earpieces. The moderator smiled too much. Elaine sat opposite him, a sharp burgundy suit framing her like armor. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Johnson," she said when the mics were live, "you're charming, and I'm sure your daughter is lovely, but this program is dangerous. It teaches children to solve problems with physical confrontation." Dwayne didn't blink. "It teaches them to solve problems by facing them, not hiding. By working through conflict, not ignoring it." Elaine leaned forward. "And what happens when a child gets hurt? Who takes responsibility when a wrestling move goes too far? We have teachers, counselors, trained professionals to guide kids." "You're not an educator." "I'm a father," he replied, "and I've watched kids grow more in that ring in a week than some do in a semester of scripted lessons." She smiled coldly. "That's a nice soundbite." He matched her gaze. "It's not a soundbite if it's true," the moderator interjected, directing a viewer question about bullying. Dwayne answered first, carefully explaining how the program created accountability, how empathy was woven into the curriculum, how even Stacy, once the cruelest kid in the room, had now become a mentor in training for younger students. Elaine interrupted. "But you don't see what's happening outside your perfect example. I've spoken to parents. I've read emails. There are real concerns. Kids feeling excluded, intimidated. A culture of competition, not community. Maybe that's what happens when you don't let kids participate," he replied. "The problem isn't the program, it's when people like you try to sabotage it instead of strengthening it." That landed harder than he intended. Elaine's eyes darkened. Her jaw clenched. But she didn't respond, not with words. She simply turned to the camera, smiled sweetly, and said, "I urge every parent watching to ask themselves, do you want your child in a classroom or a cage?" The broadcast ended with an awkward handshake. The internet exploded. Clips of the exchange hit social media within the hour. Hashtags trended. "I respect the ring," WWE Youth, Johnson vs. Mercer. Twitter was a battlefield. Some praised Elaine as a voice of reason. Others accused her of classism, of underestimating kids who needed outlets like Tiana had. And in the eye of that storm, Tiana sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by letters. Dozens of them mailed to the school, forwarded by her principal, sent from kids she'd never met, from Iowa, Georgia, California. Each one had a story, a name, a kid like her. One letter ended with, "I don't have a ring, but I pretend I do. I even made a belt out of tinfoil. When I'm in it, I feel strong. I feel like I matter. Thank you, Tiana." She looked up at her dad, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "Daddy," she whispered, holding out the letter, "they need it." And Dwayne realized it wasn't just about East Hill anymore. This was bigger now. This was a movement, but so was the opposition. And Elaine Mercer was about to take her campaign national. The flyers were everywhere, posted on community boards, slipped into PTA folders, circulated through email chains with subject lines that sounded innocent, but buzzed with alarm. Is your child safe in the ring? What the media isn't telling you about youth wrestling programs. Elaine Mercer's campaign didn't march, it crept. Subtle, precise. Tapping into fear the way only someone truly skilled in control could. She called it Project Preserve. On the surface, it looked like a concerned parent advocacy group. Beneath it, a full-fledged campaign to dismantle Respect the Ring before it could spread. Her allies grew, parents from more affluent districts, columnists who thrived on divisive narratives. A polished website appeared overnight, testimonials from concerned families, blurry photos of scraped elbows and bruised knees, headlines curated to stir panic, and just like that, the story shifted again, from local hero builds confidence through wrestling to national controversy over wrestling in schools. But if Elaine was sharpening her words, Dwayne was laying foundations, not in headlines, but in people. Since the board vote, Respect the Ring had gone regional. 3 schools had launched pilot programs using East Hill as a blueprint. Each one adapted to its own culture. Some leaned into anti-bullying workshops, others combined the program with physical education and emotional wellness classes. What bound them all was a single principle. Strength isn't about overpowering, it's about understanding your power. 1 week after the panel debate, Dwayne sat with his team in a small community center outside Atlanta. No suits, no fanfare, just folding chairs and honest conversation. With school leaders, program mentors, and a few freshly minted student coaches, all teenagers who had once been labeled difficult. He listened, took notes, asked questions, the same way he did in wrestling locker rooms and script meetings. Contact, stillness, respect. One student, a 17-year-old named Jaden, described how he'd been suspended 3 times before joining the program. I didn't stop being angry, Jaden said, but now I know why I'm angry. I know how to sit with it. Dwayne sat with that. These weren't stats for talking points. These were lives, slowly steering themselves back on course. Still, behind every success, he could feel the shadow stretching. Elaine's voice was louder than ever, and soon it wouldn't be hers alone. Back at East Hill, Tiana noticed the shift before the adults did. She saw it in the way some parents looked at her now. Tight smiles, half curious, half judging. She saw it in her teacher's hesitation when discussing the program. Even a few kids, once eager to join the ring, had stopped showing up. One afternoon, as they packed up their mats behind the school, Mateo kicked the edge of a cone and muttered, "My mom says I'm not allowed to come anymore." Tiana froze. "Why?" Mateo shrugged, embarrassed. She said it's too intense. Said she saw stuff online. Tiana blinked. "But you like it here." He looked at her, then looked away. "I know." She watched him walk off toward the parking lot where his mom stood beside their car, arms crossed. Tiana's stomach sank. It wasn't fair. Mateo was finally laughing more, talking more. He was getting better. Why couldn't people see that? That night at dinner she sat unusually quiet. Her mashed potatoes went untouched. She pushed corn around her plate like it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Dwayne noticed. "You okay, T?" She didn't answer at first. Then, softly, "Is it going away?" He set down his fork. "What is?" "The ring. The real one. The one we're building." Dwayne studied her. "Why do you think that?" "Because people are getting scared again," she said. "And when people get scared, they listen to the loudest voice." Dwayne leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You're not wrong." She looked up, eyes wide. "So what do we do?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "We get louder, but not with shouting, with stories." The next morning, a new video hit the Respect the Ring website. Not polished, not staged. Just Dwayne, sitting on the gym floor at East Hill, kids training behind him in the background. He looked straight into the camera. "My name's Dwayne Johnson. Most people know me from wrestling or movies or maybe just my eyebrow. But today, I want to talk to you as a dad." He paused, letting the silence sit. "My daughter was bullied. Not for something she did wrong, but for being proud of who she is. We started this program because we believe every kid deserves a place where they can stand tall, where their voice matters, where being strong doesn't mean hurting people, it means helping them. If that makes some people uncomfortable, maybe that's a good thing." Behind him, Tiana ran drills with a younger girl, correcting her form with gentle words and a quiet nod. Dwayne continued, "If you've got questions, come ask them. If you've got fears, let's talk. But don't tear something down because you don't understand it yet. Respect the ring is more than wrestling. It's what happens after the match ends, when kids walk home different, braver, quieter inside." The video exploded, not in the way Elaine's team anticipated, but in the way a match turns when the crowd finally sees the underdog's potential. Hashtags trended again, this time from parents, teachers, students. Testimonials poured in, a high. School principal in Detroit requested a consultation. A group of foster homes in Texas started adapting the model. A mental health nonprofit offered funding for curriculum development, and in the chaos, something shifted. Stacy knocked on the Johnsons' front door one evening, standing awkwardly with her hands in her jacket pockets. Tiana opened it, startled. Stacy looked different, not smaller, but softer. "My mom says we're moving," she said, voice flat. "She's taking some job in D.C., wants to help with the national rollout or whatever. She says I can't do the program anymore." Tiana didn't speak. Stacy shifted on her feet. "I just wanted to say sorry." Tiana tilted her head. "For what?" "For all of it," Stacy said. "I was just mad that someone like you was braver than me." Tiana stepped outside, pulling the door. Closed behind her. "You still can be," she said. They stood there for a moment in the quiet. Two girls who'd once been enemies, now just kids, both caught in a wave bigger than them. Later that night, Dwayne opened a padded envelope, delivered to their porch. Inside was a letter, printed on thick stock. At the top, White House Office of Public Engagement. He scanned the message, then read it again. They were being invited to speak, not at a school, not at a fundraiser, but at the Capitol. A formal hearing was being assembled on national youth development programs. Respect the Ring had been listed by name for review, and Elaine Mercer had already signed on as a lead witness. Washington, D.C. felt heavier than the headlines. The Capitol loomed like something from a painting, bigger in presence than in size. White stone, unmoving columns, and yet it pulsed with the quiet thrum of decisions being made behind closed doors, decisions that could ripple into homes and hallways across the country. Dwayne stood outside the rotunda in a tailored, dark gray suit, his silhouette framed by the sharp, cold morning light. He wasn't new to pressure. He'd faced WrestleMania main events, held press junkets across 3 time zones, stood under lights brighter than these. But never like this. This wasn't about him. It was about a 6-year-old girl who had worn a paper crown to school and been laughed at for daring to be proud. It was about a cardboard wrestling belt, a cracked gym floor, a community that didn't just need a program, they needed a space, somewhere to be loud, somewhere to be themselves. He looked down at Tiana beside him. Her hair was pulled back into 2 neat braids. She wore a dark blue blazer with a tiny golden pin in the shape of a wrestling ring, one of the first custom-made symbols of the growing program. Her shoes were polished, her hands clasped in front of her, and around her neck still hung the silver belt pendant he'd given her months ago. "You ready?" he asked, voice low. Tiana nodded, but her hand slipped into his anyway. Inside the chamber, the seats were full. Senators, staffers, media. At the head of the table, Elaine Mercer sat in crisp ivory, posture perfect, smile practiced. Her opening remarks were already printed in front of her. She exuded poise. This was her arena. She was here not to defend, but to dismantle. A congressional committee chair tapped the gavel. "This hearing will come to order." Today's session concerns the rise of extracurricular programs built around unconventional models for youth engagement, particularly those that are privately funded or celebrity-backed. We will begin with our invited witnesses. Elaine went first, and she came. Prepared, her voice was calm, her pace measured. She cited statistics, accidents in youth sports, unregulated activity programs. She used words like hijacked curriculum, celebrity overreach, and unsupervised aggression. She framed Respect the Ring as a Trojan horse, flashy, persuasive, and ultimately dangerous. Respect the Ring is not about character building, she said coolly. It's about branding. It's about placing ideology above education. Our schools are not arenas. She sat down to a wave of silent approval from a few suited heads. And then Dwayne stood, no notes, no speech, just his voice, measured, firm. "My name is Dwayne Johnson," he began. "I'm not an educator. I'm not a policymaker. I'm a father." A pause. The room leaned in. "When my daughter came home crying because a group of kids made fun of her for dressing like her own parent, something broke in me. Not because it hurt my feelings. I've had worse said in locker rooms and press junkets. It broke me because I realized how early kids learn shame, how early they're taught that being different means being alone." He gestured gently toward Tiana. "So I didn't build Respect the Ring to show kids how to fight. I built it to show them how to stand, how to plant their feet in a world that too often asks them to shrink." He began describing the curriculum, how emotional literacy was woven into the warm-ups, how the respect match at the end of each week required students to partner with someone they didn't get along with and work together. No fists, no egos, just kids learning what it means to fall and get back up with someone else's. Hand helping them, he turned to the panel. "You want to talk about oversight? Let's build it. Standards, let's write them. But don't kill something just because you don't understand it yet. That's the very thing we're trying to unteach." The room sat still, quiet enough to hear the soft whir of the air vents above, and then a hand raised at the far end of the dais. A senator from New York. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "I think the most telling indicator of a program's impact is hearing from the children in it. Would you be open to allowing your daughter to speak briefly?" Dwayne looked to Tiana. She gave the smallest nod. She stood and walked to the microphone. "I'm Tiana," she said. "I used to be scared to go to school, but now I'm not." She took a breath. "I used to think being strong meant keeping quiet when people were mean. But now I think strong means saying something, even if your voice shakes." She looked around the room. Some people think Respect the Ring is about wrestling, but it's not. It's about learning to be proud of who you are, even if that's different. Silence, and then a single clap. Then another, until the entire room, lawmakers, aides, parents, was applauding. Even Elaine Mercer, for a single moment, looked like she wasn't sure what to say. In the weeks that followed, the hearing became a cultural moment. Clips of Tiana's speech went viral. The video of Dwayne's testimony was replayed on news networks across the country, but more importantly, legislation began moving. A bipartisan bill was drafted proposing federal funding for alternative youth development programs, starting with a pilot initiative called the Respect Model. It didn't just include wrestling. It opened the door for all programs that blended physical engagement with emotional literacy and peer accountability, and Respect the Ring. It didn't just survive, it expanded. With the help of WWE and educational consultants, it launched its own nonprofit wing. Trained instructors, safety standards, a full curriculum. By the end of the year, 38 schools across 11 states had active chapters. The logo, two open hands forming the shape of a wrestling ring, became a symbol of a growing movement. And at the center of it all, Tiana Johnson, not a mascot, not just Dwayne's daughter, but a quiet leader with a voice strong enough to move a room of lawmakers. 1 year later, the East Hill Elementary gym buzzed with energy. Parents clapped from folding chairs. Teachers filmed on their phones. The final match of the season's exhibition day had just ended. 2 fifth graders shaking hands in the center of the ring. Dwayne stood off to the side, arms folded, smiling. Tiana, now 7, stood beside a small podium with a golden microphone, her idea. She tapped it twice, then cleared her throat. "Thank you for coming to our end-of-year showcase," she said, confident. "We've had 57 students in the program this year, and 0 suspensions for bullying." The crowd erupted in cheers. "And before we close," she continued, "we wanted to say something to anyone watching who doesn't have a program like this yet." She looked directly into the camera. "We're not just teaching wrestling, we're teaching kids to believe in themselves, and you can do it too. You just need a mat, a coach, and someone who says, 'You matter?'" Later, as the chairs were stacked and the lights dimmed, Dwayne placed an arm around her shoulders. "You did good, Tiny," she grinned. "I know. Ready to build the next one?" She nodded. "Let's go find a bigger ring." They walked out together into the evening air, the summer breeze warm on their skin, the sound of laughter echoing behind them. The paper crown? Long gone. But the legacy it sparked? That was just getting started.